Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to introduce you guys to GRR, which stands for Google Rapid Response. And this is an open source project that was developed initially by Google employees to monitor their infrastructure. And they were able to make some good progress on it and thankfully made it an open source solution that people can implement within their own networks. And what GRR exactly is they advertise it as an incident response framework focused on remote live forensics. So what this allows us to do is actually able to traverse file systems from a remote location. So say for example, and they detail a few scenarios down here. So say for example, we got a Wazoo alert for a new file added to, let's say, Joe's laptop here. And we want to do a little further digging, but of course we don't have access to Joe's workstation, and we also can't look at the contents of the file within Wazoo. So if it's like a text file, we couldn't actually extract it and view the contents of it. And this is exactly what that tool allows us to do. So if we see some weird file was added to Joe's endpoint, to Joe's laptop, we want to investigate it further, we can do that now remotely. So our InfoSec team can use this GRR tool to extract the file from Joe's endpoint and analyze it accordingly, and then we can take further steps from there. And it is a really powerful tool, and is a really flexible tool to get that remote forensic and investigation gathering. And say Joe's file is actually malicious, say that the file we extracted from Joe's endpoint is actually malicious, this tool also allows us to run what they call a hunt. So we could then tell GRR, hey, let's hunt for this particular file name and let's find out what exact endpoints this file has actually been written to. And is a really nice tool to add to our security fleet. So stick around and we'll jump into it. And all right, so first of all, the install process is divvied up into two parts. We first have our client, and then we have our server. So if you've been following along with the Wazoo series, this client would be like our Wazoo agent, and this server would be like our Wazoo manager. So this client will be deployed onto all endpoints, whether that be user laptops, servers within our infrastructure, whatever endpoints we want to deploy it to, and then they will all report to our GRR server. And our GRR server comes with a friendly web interface that our InfoSec team can log into and be able to run jobs and queries and hunts all from a friendly web interface, which is nice. They also have an API endpoint, but more to come on that later. We'll be able to automate some of this in future videos. But we first need to install our GRR server. So I'll jump onto this guy, and this is actually, they recommend within their documentation here, they recommend Ubuntu 18.0.4. They've built all their packages for this specific release. They do say it can work on Debian or other Ubuntu versions, but they do all their testing on 18.0.4, so I like to follow their recommended operating system, just so we don't have to do any more debugging than we may already have to do. And so what we'll first need to do is install MySQL. So GRR is storing all of its data into the MySQL server, which is a free database that we can deploy and is our one prereq before getting GRR up and running. So we need to make sure we have installed the MySQL server, and then we've also created some databases that you see in these later on commands here. So first, let's copy this guy out, and I'll link to the documentation within the video as well. And if we jump on this guy, I'll run a apt install. And let me throw this off to the side while that's going on in the background there. All right, and now that that's installed, so we should see that it's running. And okay, good. The service is running, so that looks good. So now we can interact with our MySQL server and now create our databases that we need that are required for GRR to function. So we'll go ahead and jump into interacting with MySQL so that we'll be able to run these commands below. And first we are authenticating with the root user, and we're using the -p flag to get prompted to enter a password. So you see we can enter our password here, and I'll just say demo. All right, and now once that is set, now when you lose your session and want to log back in, say for example I exit out, and then let's get back into it. It's asking for the password. I'll say demo, and we're now back in. So that looks good there. And then we first need to, so this max allow packet is required so that GRR can write successfully to our SQL database. So we'll copy this guy, and you should get a response similar to this. And then we'll create our GRR user, and then we'll say, and then here we'll set a password for our GRR user. I'll just leave it at default as password, but of course if you're rolling this out into a production environment, that's something you would want to change. So we say okay here. Let's now create our GRR database. So we'll create that, and we get an okay, and we get one row affected. And now let's allow our GRR user to access this GRR database. So we'll copy that, say okay, and we should get a similar response. And now let's create our FleetSpeak user. FleetSpeak is something that's running under the hood to best scale and speed up hunts and queries for particular files. So it's something new that they've added and just really helps beef up performance for GRR. So this really shouldn't be something that we interact with too often, but we still need to create a user, so similar to what we just did above, and create a FleetSpeak database. So we'll run that, we get an okay. Let's go ahead and create the database now. All right, good. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll allow this FleetSpeak user to interact with the FleetSpeak database. So say okay, and that all looks good, and I'll go ahead and exit out. So now we are done interacting with MySQL. This should just be a one-time thing that you have to set. So after this, we shouldn't need to have to work with MySQL anymore, unless, of course, something goes wrong. And now we can let's go ahead and grab the package that will install GRR and everything for us. So once that's downloaded, we can then run this command here, and this will go through the install process of installing GRR and also the FleetSpeak service. They're packaged together, which is nice, so we don't have to do them separately. And so running that, it'll go out and grab dependencies. It's running Python. It's using a lot of Python 3 under the hood to serve your web UI and for clients and so on and so forth. All right, and so here it's asking if we want to use FleetSpeak. I'll go ahead and just say yes. Saying enter the host name, I'll just leave it at the default, which is this GRR server. And then we'll specify the port that we want FleetSpeak to use, which we'll just leave at the default. The MySQL host. So you could configure MySQL on a dedicated box to, if you're wanting to cluster this together for high availability. You 100% could do that, and you could spin up a box that is just dedicated to running MySQL, and you would interact with, and you would run similar commands. You would just, of course, replace your local host. So you can do that if you want to distribute it, and you would just need to make sure that you point to the correct endpoint that is running your SQL server and is hosting your databases that you need to connect to. But in this demo, we just ran it on the local host, the socket, which is used by MySQL by default, so that should be good. The database name, of course, is FleetSpeak. You could, of course, change this if you want to. But where we created our database FleetSpeak, that's what we named it, so we'll keep it at that. So here we can say the username to use, and I'll say FleetSpeak, because that's the user that we created. It's now asking for the password, and that, of course, is just password. And then here we see successfully connected to MySQL with given configuration. So that looks good. All right, and now let's work on the GRR side of things. So first we'll tell GRR, okay, where is your MySQL server and database located? And it's just on the local host. The MySQL port, we'll just leave it the default. The database is GRR. The username we're using is GRR, and then the password will be password. And it's asking for SSL. I don't have that set up, so I'll just say no. Now it's asking for a host name, so yeah, GRR server is fine. And now here we'll configure our front end URL. Because this isn't a host name that has been added to DNS entries, I of course wouldn't be able to connect there, so I will specify the exact IP, which is 162.251.147.46, and I'll say let's listen on port 8080, and I'll say / here. And so this is the URL that our clients will connect to communicate with our server. So they do say here, you know, for best results, this should be publicly accessible. So it really just kind of depends on how you want to deploy this. If you want to deploy this in a fashion to where employee laptops, regardless of where they're working, as long as they're connected to the internet, you want to be able to grab files from them, then you would want to make this publicly accessible, or else they would have to VPN into your network to be able to communicate with your front end that is running our GRR server. But of course, if you just want this strictly only for internal use, you want to monitor your internal infrastructure, then by all means, this can just be an internal address that you have set for this that all your internal servers can connect to. But for this demo, I'll tie it to my public-facing IP address so that I'll be able to go through it with you guys. So we'll say yes, so we'll specify that, and now we're specifying the admin web interface. And this is something that if you do publicly expose it, I highly recommend standing it up behind a reverse proxy such as Nginx or Apache so that you can control who has access to this administrative interface. This is a very powerful tool and could cause a lot of damage if a malicious actor gets onto this web interface. So just take your precaution there and make sure you're protecting this web interface as best as possible. But for this demo, I'll just publicly expose it so that I'll be able to demonstrate it for you guys. And then they're asking for the port there, so it looks good. You'll notice the web interface listens on port 8000, where the interface that our agents will connect to, they'll send their logs and events to port 8080. So that looks good. There's also some monitoring email stuff you can set up. I'm just gonna skip through those for now. And now it is doing the initialization and is finishing the install for us. And once this is done, we should be able to now, with our web browser, navigate to this guy here. And it should ask for our credentials. Okay, good. Yeah, so we can say admin here. Oh, it's asking for a password for admin, sorry. I'll say demo. And now it's going to ask if we want to repackage clients with this configuration. So the client installation process, and you'll see here in a few minutes, these binaries will come with this GRR install, and that's all bundled up to be able to run on a handful of operating systems. So Linux, whether it be Debian or an RPM package that's needed for that particular operating system, that's supported. Windows is also supported, and I believe Mac OS is supported as well, but we'll see here in a sec. But here we'll just specify that since this is a new install, we'll say, yeah, let's go ahead and re-download the templates, and we'll also repack them as well. It is reaching out and grabbing the package templates and then repackaging them to fit our specific GRR server, right? Because we made a few changes. We need to tell the agents, in particular, the URL and port that you're going to connect to that you're going to connect to. And so with the repackaging, that is now taking the settings that we applied and adding them to those binaries. So now all we'll have to do is run a like an RPM install or an apt install, or execute the Windows executable on our endpoints, and that'll be pre-configured with our configuration settings that we just set. So they'll be able to connect to our GRR server accordingly. And so now we've got our installation is complete. Do you want to restart the service? And we'll say yes. And so then once that is up and running, we should be able to connect to our web interface here. And all right, so that looks good. Let's so again, the GRR server will run as a service. So if we say GRR service, that looks good. And then if the other one is of course our Fleet Speak, which also is bundled to run as a service. Oh, I did Fleet Speak service, not server. So we do that. And we have a failure. Okay. Let me see if there's any logging. See if we got anything here. Failed to listen on. Okay. Oh, so it's trying to look it up via the host name. Okay, so it's trying. So it can't resolve this host name. So what I'll go ahead and do as a hack around is we'll just edit the host file. And then let me grab the address real quick. I'll just edit so I'm just editing the local host file here to where we won't have to make a DNS query for this hostname GRR server. So now if I ping GRR server on the box locally, we can connect. Okay, so let's try to restart again. And let's try a status. Okay, cool, and that's running. Okay, so it just, so it ended up that it couldn't resolve the hostname of GRR server, and it was of course using Google's DNS servers to try to resolve that, but as I mentioned earlier, this hasn't been added to any DNS entries or anything, so it's not going to be able, so Google wouldn't be able to resolve this hostname. As a hack around, we can just add it to the local host file so that we're not having to query DNS to resolve that hostname. And if we run a netstat, we should see all the ports listening appropriately. So yeah, we see Fleet Speak listening here. Our GRR is listening here. And so now let's go ahead and connect to this guy. So we'll navigate here. Oh, that's 80 or 8,000. Okay, there we go. So say admin and then demo. And now we are in the web UI. And here you can see, we don't have any clients. But here you can see everything that we can run within the web UI. So now let's get a client up and running. So if we go into our binary section here, and as part of the install, these were all packaged with our current config settings. That looks good. And then here you can see our different installers. So there's depending on the operating system that you're wanting to install this on, you'll just select the appropriate installer. So I'll go ahead and download this RPM to my just to my local box, and let me jump on to one of my servers here that will act as our client. All right, and so that's connected. I'll navigate just to the temp directory and I'll just throw it there. All right, and now let me jump on this guy and navigate into the temp directory here, and here you see our RPM. So here I'll just run an RPM-IV to install and do it in a verbose mode. So if we have any errors, we hopefully should see that output. And I'll just point to that RPM. And again, Fleet Speak is part of our deployment here, and it looks like I was running into the same issue. So it can't resolve this host name. So let me add that to my local host file on this guy as well. And I'll just go ahead and copy this entry here, and paste that, and I should be able to now ping GRR server. Okay, good. And let me restart this process, and hopefully now we can see a connection. We're getting this 404 response. I'm not sure if that is something we should be, well, we should immediately see if it's connected or not by doing the search. And actually, okay, it looks like it's connected. Now we can remotely pull files from this particular endpoint. We can also run an interrogation, and this will dump out users. And actually, it's grabbed a lot of that already. So it sees our version, sees the architecture, the kernel version that this system is running on, and also some hardware specs that are allocated to it. And now let's look for a file. So if I jump onto this guy, and let me just create a text file here. So I'll say test.txt. So I'll open this guy up. I'll just say please subscribe. So again, this is a file that's being added onto our endpoint agent, onto our endpoint here. And now let's run a flow that will find this file. So if I go into file system, I'll say file finder, and here it's asking for our path. So I need to point to the path where this file is written to on the agent, which of course is just op test.txt. Path type, of course, you could change if, like, for example, this is a Windows host and you're looking for registry keys. You could do that. I think by default, though, if you leave it at OS, it'll determine what operating system that agent is and set these accordingly. And I'll change this to download, so that we'll download this file to our GRR server so that we can look at it further. So I'll go ahead and select launch, and we should see now this job kick up. And we get our output here, so a flow file finder completed with 1 result. So let's go ahead and jump into that and see what that looks like. So here we can see the output of our job. So it looks like it has finished successfully. Let's jump into log real quick, and yeah, it looks like it found and processed 1 file, so it looks like it found it, so good. And now, let's go into our results, and here we can see our op/test.txt file that we grabbed, and now this is on our GRR server, and we can now look into this further. So if we go ahead and select this value here, we see our test.txt file, we see creation time, we see the time that the file was created, but even cooler, so I could download this locally to my laptop if I wanted to inspect further, or upload it to a sandbox or whatever you like to use for your analysis. But if we also jump into text view, here we see the output of the file. And we're doing this remotely, which is awesome, right? We're not having to jump onto the endpoint to see the contents of a particular file. And of course, because the contents of the file are just a clear text, please subscribe, we can see that here, which is really nice. And we also can get some hex output, and it's really good for running forensics. Like if one of your remote endpoints gets hit with some malware, we can now remotely extract these files without having to jump onto the endpoint to do so itself, which is really nice. Or if someone, edits like the Etsy password file, for example, we could extract that file and view what user was added to the system. And it's a really powerful tool, and it's really nice to add to your security suite. So I think that wraps it up for this video. In the next video, we'll get a little more hands-on and kind of go through a real-life investigation scenario of our antivirus software detecting a malicious file, and then kind of going through the steps that I would take to investigate this file further. So stay tuned for that, and I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.